Hi class, it's your instructor Patrick McMunn again. So in chapter 2 you learned about the smallest units of the nervous system and the supporting cells. So in this chapter you're going to learn about the larger structures of the nervous system that are made up of neurons. So again, our model of the brain here, we're going to be talking about the forebrain, most specifically in this video, which you can see here on the outside, and it's got 4 different lobes, which we'll show in some of the graphs and figures here throughout this lesson. So with that, let's talk about the structure and function of the central nervous system. The objective in this video is going to be able to identify the structures and functions of the forebrain, including the telencephalon and the diencephalon. As you can see in this slide, this is where the forebrain is located. It's the largest section of the brain, comprised of the telencephalon and the diencephalon. Now, the telencephalon, just to go over a few terms, it's known as the cerebrum. The telencephalon refers to the region of the brain that includes the cerebral cortex and several subcortical structures, including the hippocampus and the basal ganglia. It consists of the structures that are on either side of the third ventricle, including the thalamus and the hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. Now, in contrast, the diencephalon is one of the main vesicles of the brain formed during embryogenesis. During the third week of development of the neural tube, it's created from the ectoderm in 3 primary germ layers. A couple other terms here to be familiar with are the sulcus, which is any of the narrow grooves, as you can see in the brain, especially in this picture, or tissue that is marked by the convulsions or the surface of the brain. Also, the gyrus, which is the ridge on the cerebral cortex, it's generally surrounded by 1 or more sulci, or depressions or furrows. So gyri and sulci create the folded appearance of the brain in humans, or other mammals for that matter. So in this slide, you see the 4 lobes of the cerebral cortex. The 2 symmetrical hemispheres of the cortex are divided into 4 lobes. Now this figure shows the location of the 4 lobes in the primary sensory and motor cortex and the association cortex. So each primary sensory area of the cerebral cortex sends information to adjacent regions called the sensory association cortex. Circuits of the neurons in the sensory adjacent cortex analyze the information received from the primary and sends that out via the sensory motor. Perception takes place here in the sensory motor, and memories are stored there as well. Now, this figure shows the location of the 4 lobes, the primary sensory motor cortex, and the association cortex, similar to the previous slide. However, this is a side view. This is what we call the mid-sagittal view, with the cerebellum and brain stem removed. And once again, a different look. This one with the brain intact. You can see the 4 lobes here as well. So what we call the rostral, which is the front of the brain, or the caudal, which is the rear. The very front of the brain is appropriately named the frontal lobe, and the very rear is known as the primary visual cortex within the occipital lobe, which we'll talk about each lobe here now. So here's the frontal lobe. As you can see, I've got it highlighted there at the rostral section of the brain. The frontal lobe is part of the brain that controls important cognitive skills in humans, such as emotions and expressions, problem solving, memory, language, judgment, and even sexual behaviors. It is, in this essence, sort of the control panel of our personality and our ability to communicate. Moving more caudal, or the rear of the brain, is the parietal lobe. Now, the parietal lobe is vital for sensory perception and integration, included the management of your senses, which are your taste, hearing, sight, touch, and even your smell. It's also home to the brain's primary sensory area, a region of the brain that interprets input from the other areas of the body. Research suggests that the more sensory input region of the body provides, the more surface area the parietal lobe is dedicated to that area. For example, the fingers and hands are a primary site for sensory data, so much of the parietal lobe is dedicated to receiving and processing their input. Moving further back, we have the occipital lobe, which is the seat of most of the brain's visual cortex, allowing you to not only see and process stimuli from the external world, but also to assign meaning to and remember visual perceptions. Although we know that the occipital lobe isn't dedicated to vision, this process is very highly complex, and it includes a number of separate functions. Some of those include mapping the visual world, which helps us with both spatial reasoning and visual memory. Most visions come in some type of memory, since scanning the visual field requires you to recall that which you just saw a second ago. It also helps you determining color properties of the items in the visual field. It also helps you assess distance, size, and depth. It also helps to identify visual stimuli, particularly in familiar faces and objects. Transmitting visual information to other brain regions so that those brain lobes can encode memories, assign meaning, craft appropriate motor and linguistic responses, and continually respond to information from the surrounding world is a big part of what the occipital lobe does. And lastly, but even equally important, is it helps you to receive raw visual data from the perceptual sensors in your eye's retina. So the last lobes we're going to talk about are the temporal lobes. As you can see in this picture here, its position is near the temples, which suggests that the temporal lobe plays a key role in auditory processing. These roles include perceiving sounds, assigning meaning to those sounds, and remembering sounds. Much of the auditory work of the temporal lobe is processed through the superior temporal gyrus, a temporal lobe structure that receives sound input directly from the ear. Some of the other functions include the formation of visual memories, including long-term memories, in conjunction with the amygdala and hippocampus, two structures in the limbic system. The temporal lobe is vital for the formation of conscious memories. Interpreting the meaning of the visual stimuli is also an important role of the temporal lobes, including recognizing objects. It's not enough to see the object, which happens in your occipital lobe. For vision to be useful, you must understand what you're seeing and being able to associate that with your memories. The ventral part of the temporal lobe aids in the assignment of meaning and sights you take in every day. Without the ventral lobe, you wouldn't even be able to recognize faces or read body language, so it's a very important part. The temporal lobe also aids in the production of speech. Dysfunction in this area can lead to difficulty speaking, even when other structures are intact or you can consciously think about what you want to say. Temporal lobes also important for recognition of language. Our auditory cortex and temporal lobe is key for hearing and understanding speech, but a range of other structures in the temporal lobe help you understand and give meaning to that language. Without the temporal lobe, however, you couldn't name objects or even remember verbal exchanges or recognize language for that matter. Another important role of the temporal lobe is controlling unconscious and apparently automatic reactions such as appetite, thirst, and even hunger. Of course, the last thing we can talk about with the temporal lobe is helping the body maintain homeostasis. Now note that this is an important role shared by many regions of the brain, but one that's an important role with the temporal lobe as well. So that's it for the four lobes of the forebrain. I do want to bring up this slide because I think it's important. Now this slide shows a cutaway part of the frontal lobe of the left hemisphere, and this permits us to see the primary auditory cortex on the dorsal surface of the temporal lobe, which forms the ventral bank of the lateral fissure. Now, this is important because we have two little strips of area called the primary somatosensory cortex and the primary motor cortex. So the primary somatosensory cortex is responsible for processing somatic sensations. These sensations arise from receptors positioned throughout the body that are responsible for detecting touch, proprioception, which is the position of the body in space, or the nociception, which is the pain sensors, and temperature. When such receptors detect one of these sensations, the information is sent to the thalamus and then to the primary somatosensory cortex. The primary motor cortex, or the M1, is one of the principal brain areas involved in motor functioning. Now the M1 is located in the frontal lobe of the brain along the bump called the precentral gyrus. The role of the primary motor cortex is to generate neural impulses that control the execution of movement through your body and through your muscles. As you can see in this example here, the sulcus between the cortexes that divide the two areas break up the areas into the frontal and parietal lobes. So that's about it for the forebrain. We covered all of the major four lobes and a little bit more information than that, but I hope that this was helpful in illustrating what's where and what the function of each lobe does. If you have any questions whatsoever, I highly encourage you to post them in the discussion area, and that way students and I can respond to them.